Yeah, welcome back. In this fourth video we continue the report Violence, Discrimination and Neglect Towards Tibetan Children, a report submitted to the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child on violations of the Convention on the Rights of the Child by the People's Republic of China against the children of Tibet. C. Arbitrary detention in inhumane conditions and forced labor. As mentioned above, the detention of Tibetan children is usually arbitrary because it is done by executive rather than judicial action, but the arbitrariness of the detention runs deeper. Tibetan children are commonly detained for engaging in activity protected by the CRC as well as by other international instruments. Advocacy of Tibetan independence is a common cause of detention. Indeed, some children have been detained merely because they were suspected of harboring separatist sympathies. For example, a 14-year-old nun named Shukri was detained for 3 years because she had spent 10 minutes participating in a demonstration in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. Such detention violates both the children's rights to freedom of expression and their right to freedom of assembly. Children have also been detained for their religious beliefs, as in the case of a 4-year-old boy who was beaten by Chinese police because, in his view, in Tibet you are not supposed to recite any prayers or keep pictures of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Such detention violates the children's rights to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. Tibetan children are commonly detained without due process of law. In fact, detained children in Tibet receive no procedural rights. None of the children were interviewed who had been detained. None of the children we interviewed who had been detained for political activities reported receiving access to counsel, relatives or guardians of any kind prior to sentencing. For example, an 11-year-old boy was incarcerated in a PSB detention center for a full year, despite having received no judicial hearing of any kind. Likewise, a 17-year-old boy was held for 18 months, even though he was not yet charged, not permitted to contact a lawyer, not even allowed to inform his family of his detention, and received no hearing. Such detention violates the children's right to prompt access to legal and other appropriate assistance, as well as the right to challenge the legality of the deprivation of his or her liberty before a court or other competent, independent and impartial authority. The conditions in which Tibetan children are detained are often appalling. At Gutsa, the colloquial term for the PSB detention center in the Lhasa prefecture, Chokyi shared a cell with 2 other girls. Food was meager, no bedding was provided, and items for hygiene were non-existent. Chokyi developed frostbite on her hands and feet, but police officials provided no medical treatment. Children apprehended for political activities are held at the discretion of non-judicial officials in severely substandard conditions and deprived of minimal needs such as food, heat, clothing, adequate sanitation and hygiene items. Children told us that guards provided little, if any, food, a little rice porridge in the morning and half a piece of bread and cabbage in the afternoon. Breakfast was soup and tea, and sometimes they had samba flour, 1 bowl of samba daily. Health conditions were also poor. Toilets usually consisted of a single bucket that the children cleaned themselves. There was no access to clean water or other hygienic facilities. Cells rarely had windows or light. Though children often became physically sick from these deplorable conditions, none of the children we spoke with received medical care. Inadequate food, heat, clothing, etc. violate the children's right to be free from cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment. The refusal to provide medical care additionally violates the children's right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health and to facilities for the treatment of illness and rehabilitation of health. Upon transfer from a pre-sentencing detention center to a prison or re-education through labor center, some children, like adult prisoners, must perform hard labor. For example, Shukui, a 14-year-old nun, was forced by Chinese officials at Trisam to perform hard labor 5 days each week: construction, cleaning toilets and working in the fields. Likewise, a 15-year-old boy was forced by Chinese officials at Trisam to gather rocks for a construction project in shifts that ran from 24 to 48 hours. Such forced labor violates the children's right to be protected from performing any work that is likely to be hazardous or to interfere with the child's education or to be harmful to the child's health or physical, mental, spiritual, moral or social development. D. Torture in detention. Many prior reports have documented the pervasive use of torture in Tibet. Prior reports have also documented the use of torture against Tibetan children. Torture of children remains a common practice in Chinese detention centers. To obtain information and confessions, to intimidate and to punish, we found that authorities subject very young children to beatings, whipping, burns with irons and heated metal bands, electric shocks with cattle prods, forced staring at the sun, assault by police dogs, suspension in painful positions, and various forms of psychological torture, such as solitary confinement, threatening children's parents or forcing children to witness others being tortured. Virtually every child detained, whether for political activity, attempted flight to India or otherwise, suffered torture. Several young children were tortured merely for suspected association with others' political activities. Torture of children continues to be pervasive in Chinese detention centers in Tibet. A 13-year-old nun detained at Gutsa was interrogated under torture about once each week. During these sessions, guards beat her and applied electric cattle prods to the back of her neck. A 12-year-old boy had wires placed on his hands which make them black. A 13-year-old girl was subjected to electric shocks and had cold water poured over her face. When a 10-year-old boy was found attempting to escape into Nepal, guards beat his legs repeatedly with wooden sticks, joking that these were the legs that tried to escape and must be punished. They also forced him to hold heated metal bands and shocked him with cattle prods. A 12-year-old girl was beaten by Chinese police for over an hour in an effort to force her to tell them who had taught her about Tibet's freedom. A 13-year-old girl who was detained for joining a protest recalled that the guards asked, "How can you think of such things as at such a young age?" They came to slap me and began beating and boxing me. They wanted to know who put me up to the demonstration, who took me there. I was told, "If you don't tell the truth, I'll use this, the electric cattle prod." A 16-year-old girl detained for allegedly having written independence. She had written independence in her school notebook, was shocked with cattle prods. She was burned with a hot iron and threatened with death over the course of a 3-day interrogation. A 16-year-old boy was handcuffed and burned on the calf with a hot iron. In the beginning it really burned, but then I didn't feel much, he states. One of the most disturbing aspects of the torture of Tibetan women and girls is its sexualization. Previous reports have documented that women and girls, especially nuns, have been raped and sodomized with electric batons. There is some welcome evidence that the incidence of rape among young children has been declining, but it continues to occur. For example, 2 teenage girls apprehended while attempting to escape into Nepal were raped by 5 Chinese police officers. One of them was first beaten with an electric baton until she could neither see nor talk. It was only in the morning that she regained consciousness, and she was bleeding from the lower part of her body. Her friend told her what they had done to her. Torture and other cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment and punishment in schools. Corporal punishment is routinely employed in primary schools in Tibet. We do not refer here to minor physical punishment used to discipline misbehaving children. Rather, we refer to the infliction of pain and injury, which constitutes at a minimum cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment and punishment. Some of it even rises to the level of torture. A study of corporal punishment in Tibetan primary schools found that teachers beat children with sticks, bamboo staffs, whips, wires, brooms and belts, shocked some with cattle prods, made others kneel for several hours on glass, sharp stones or rectangular iron bars, forced one child to hold ice in his hands for an hour and locked another child in a dark room for 4 weeks. Beatings are the most common form of corporal punishment. Some students were forced to lie on a table and then struck with a broom. A 10-year-old boy was kicked and beaten with a wire for tardiness and small errors. A girl under the age of 12 lost a scarf which she had been given by a teacher, who then kicked her several times, took off her trousers and beat her so badly that she could not attend school for 2 days. Another common form of corporal punishment is being forced to kneel in various painful positions, as on glass, sharp rocks or metal bars. For example, one boy under the age of 10 at the time described being forced to kneel for 2 to 3 hours on a rectangular bar with a sharp point in the middle. For a minor misbehavior, he knelt on the flat surface. For a more serious infraction, the teacher forced him to kneel on the sharp point. Other methods of corporal punishment are also employed. A primary school student failed to hold the Chinese flag at an assembly as required, whether deliberately or through inadvertence, and school authorities pricked him repeatedly with a pin and burned the area around the wounds with a stick of incense. This is cruelty that without any A boy under the age of 13 was given electric shocks, imprisoned in a dark room for 4 weeks and deprived of adequate food and water. Such treatment violates the children's right to be free of torture or other cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment. It is also a breach of China's obligation to ensure that school discipline is administered in a manner consistent with the child's human dignity and in conformity with the CRC. F. Pervasive anti-Tibetan discrimination. Over the years, systematic anti-Tibetan discrimination, linguistic and religious, by Chinese authorities in Tibet has been documented. It is not clear whether Tibetan children are arbitrarily detained, subjected to forced labor, and tortured more commonly than are Chinese children detained for alleged political activity. But it is clear that in Tibet, Tibetan children are far more likely to engage in or to be suspected of engaging in such activity than are Chinese children. Thus, the infliction of such violations of international law on Tibetan children is, at least arguably, inherently discriminatory. Tibetan children also suffer pervasive discrimination with respect to corporal punishment in schools. In some schools attended by both Tibetan children and Chinese children, corporal punishment are inflicted exclusively on the Tibetan children. In others, corporal punishments are also inflicted on Chinese children, but far more rarely and less severely than on Tibetan children. When Tibetan children fight with Chinese children, even in self-defense, the Tibetan children are beaten, but the Chinese children are not. Tibetan children also have less recourse than do Chinese children in cases of abusive corporal punishment, because most of the school authorities are Chinese government officials. Some children have even been threatened with retribution against their parents if they complained. Tibetan children are also subjected to humiliation and degrading treatment. For example, one girl, Rowley, 10 years old at the time, said that Chinese teachers at her primary school in Lhasa verbally harassed Tibetan students by calling them me, which she said is a terrible word in Tibetan, meaning the person does not exist. Me is a derogatory pronoun for woman in colloquial Tibetan with no exact equivalent in English. Another boy, Rowley, 8 or 9 years old at the time, recalled similar incidents at his primary schools in Lhasa. The Chinese teacher would call us Ke, the male equivalent of me. Finally, the most severe cases of corporal punishment, as with the most severe cases of arbitrary detention and torture, are inflicted for acts perceived to have political significance. For example, a boy under the age of 13 reported that Tibetan students in his Lhasa primary school who talked about the Dalai Lama were taken to another room and given electric shocks to the temples from an object resembling a hand radio. Also, in some instances, Chinese school teachers would arrange for students to be driven by jeep to the police, who would themselves administer electric shocks and detain children for talking about the Dalai Lama or engaging in other acts deemed political. Such cooperations between primary schools authorities and state police suggests that the Chinese government's intense preoccupation with political control in Tibet extends even to young children. It also underscores a broader conclusion about the education system in Tibet, to which the evidence points that it is intended less to prepare Tibetan children to be productive members of a modern society than it is to secure political compliance among a resentful population. Yeah, we continue in next video. Yeah, video 5 it will be.